There were good points and bad points during the Trouble. There was high tension all the time in that there was community strife, and mostly there was the community against the authorities. My memories of the start of the Trouble was that in the middle of the night the army used to come and raid houses and take away people. So what everybody did was swapped houses with neighbours. So when the army came they couldn't find whoever it was they were looking for. So everybody got to know everybody else very well and got to know what their houses were like. And in the evenings, there was a general swap on the Glen Road. Everybody swapped houses. And then next morning, they went back to their own houses to pick up their things to go to work. There was a great community spirit and everybody shared everything.
I remember one particular night there was a gun battle that went on between, in Clonard where we lived, that I'm not sure where the shooting came into Clonard from, but I think it probably came from around Sugarville Street on the Shankill. And there was firing going back from Clonard. And I remember someone being shot in the entry behind us and hearing him scream. And I wanted to go out, me and my brother wanted to go out and bring him in, but my aunt stood against the door and barred her way. And listened to this man screaming. I don't know what happened to him, whether he survived or... but it was a dreadful experience.
I had my first child in 1969 and I had my second in 1970. And the soldiers had just arrived. There was a baby clinic on the Springfield Road and I used to go down with the kids just to meet people. I remember coming home and Terry was in the pram and Liam was sitting on it, and I had a wee seat for the top of the pram. And the soldiers were all at the bottom of the seat. And I remember thinking, this is not normal.
I was interned on the 1st of January 1973 and was in Armagh jail for 18 months with quite a few other women. Initially they didn't want to intern women because they thought it might be bad press, but they eventually did. I was the first, and then there were several, a few hundred women interned and imprisoned in Armagh prison.
A lot of it was very scary, I have to say, but you also just become to accept it, that this was, you try to live as normal a life as possible given the situation that you were in. It is difficult looking back because it brings all sorts of memories.
My son said to me the other day, you know, we've missed all that. We missed it, and I think, gosh, you didn't miss an awful lot. What you missed was fear and heartache and violence and trauma. And to survive that fear and heartache and violence and trauma, you had to have some sort of collectivisation, people coming together to support each other. Belfast was a very repressive male society. It was very anti-children, you know, all these children should be seen and not heard, and women, you know, didn't go out a lot, didn't socialise a lot. There was no such thing as women going downtown for a night with the girls. You know, my mother always says if you got a taxi home in the evening, you were a loose woman and the talk of the neighbourhood. It was very repressive.
I do remember one time being in city centre, because I worked in a chartered accountant's office one time before I went to nurse, and on the way home the buses had all been taken off the road and there was violent shooting at Divis. It was a very scary time. We had to walk from the city centre right up into Andersonstown. People were very aware of what was going on. Young people were aware of what was going on. And basically that's when people started getting very politicised, and perhaps maybe it was a gut reaction first of all before the politics entered, but there was a sense of a serious situation in the city, and that things were never going to be the same again.
I was certainly in Belfast the night internment broke out in '71. It's one of the strongest memories of that time, really. Lying in bed and hearing this awful noise. I'm wondering what it was. And it was the people out banging bin lids and shouting and screaming. And I remember it being quite a sort of foggy night and misty, and not quite being able to make out what was going on. But the general feeling of absolute, I suppose, confusion and fear that there was. You know. And I can remember the car driving up and the people shouting out, "It's internment, internment." And then driving off, and that was the two women who were shot dead in that car just on the Springfield Road just moments later. And I remember seeing the sparks flying up the street and thinking, what is that? What is that sparks? And it was the army coming up the street with barbed wire and the sparks as it hit the street. And then had the wee whippet cars which had heavy machine guns mounted on the top, and they were firing up and down the Springfield Road. And there was tear gas, and people were bringing out buckets of water and vinegar that was meant to be an antidote. And they'd put them on the street corners, and you'd go up and wipe your face in this water and vinegar and hope for relief from the tear gas. It was a dreadful, frightening night.
When internment happened, women really took control of the situation, and women were the ones who organised the visits, and women did the food parcels, and women did Green Cross, women did all those sort of things, and women were probably much more in charge than they had been before.
I think internment allowed women to find their voice and come together to survive, not because, you know, it was some great opportunity, but it was, how do we survive this? You know, how do we protect our families, our friends, our community from what's happening here?
The rents and rates strike happened as a result of internment. It was at a meeting in relation to internment and the rents and rates strike that I saw Christopher Napier on a stage at St Mary's Hall, and he was a solicitor, and after the meeting I went and asked him could I work for him. So it was sort of as a result of the rents and rates strike, and definitely as a result of internment, that I started practicing law.
Women Against Imperialism is really when we first started to take to the streets to complain and campaign about stuff. We took on a lot of issues and went public with them, which brought us an awful lot of flack, really, and criticism. I remember we did a series of talks around pubs and clubs where we linked anti-imperialist violence to violence against women. And people were outraged. But an awful lot of women actually made the links as well when we were doing those talks. And it allowed, I think, you know, it allowed women to come together and start to mention those things, start to mention violence. Yeah, it does exist in this community. But for us, it was something that we couldn't not talk about any longer. You know, we couldn't not put it in those terms any longer.
The rent and rate strike, a lot of people suffered eventually after that because the Payment for Debt Act, then they wanted it back off you again. So you were left in debt, and you know you knew they were going to get it off you again somehow. But at the time you didn't care. This was your only way of protesting. So a lot of people, you know, did support it, came out very strongly, and there was marches. I mean, you were always marching. How else could you challenge what was happening? There wasn't an awful lot of venues open to you, and the only thing was, you know, to march.
The issue of the protest came when the women were imprisoned and there was political status taken off them. So when new Republican prisoners came in, then they were treated as ordinary prisoners. And there was a campaign in the H blocks and in Armagh prison to reinstate political status, which Margaret Thatcher withdrew. So there was then a campaign of supporting the women in Armagh prison.
The women in jail weren't allowed any access to sanitary protection or toilets or showers, and were locked in their cells. And we'd been protesting outside Armagh jail about that, and we chose an International Women's Day because we wanted it to get back to being a day of action as opposed to a day of conference and discussion. We wanted to take to the streets and do something. And it wasn't even a very big demo, and a lot of women had their children on it. And actually the demonstration was over when the cops attacked it and started to arrest people, and then arrested. There was, I think, 11 women and 3 men arrested, and they only charged the women. And that was the start of the whole big Armagh campaign, really.
That became an annual thing. We always went to the prison and protested outside the prison. Sometimes we would have delegations of women from Britain. There was sometimes the troops out would come and protest with us, but it was an annual event, the protest outside the prison.
We had a women's department in Sinn Féin, and we realised through, you know, meeting local people, demonstrations and all of that, that there was a need for a centre for women where they could come and feel safe. And we felt that it would be ideal if we could get it locally.
I think the idea of the women's centre had been sort of floating about before then. How do you create a space for women that's safe in the middle of so much poverty and hardship and trauma? And, you know, it was a Conservative government at that time that were really attacking women as well. You know, attacking women as single parents. They brought in the Payment of Debt Act, which could take money out of, you know, your social security or your benefits for the, you know, for your electricity arrears or whatever. So women were really being hammered on all sides, and it was like, how do we create a wee space somewhere that you could, where women would feel safe enough to be able to tackle these issues, to be able to think about them, to be able to organise about them, but mostly to feel safe and be able to discuss them.
Sinn Féin had their press centre was on the Falls Road, and they were leaving it, so they gave it to us. Now, it was a mess, I have to say, but we then we talked about it, and a lot of the women within Sinn Féin were also of the opinion that I was, that it had to be non-party political. So we got the premises, and then we contacted the housing executive, and we got it for a peppercorn rent, which was £1 or something like that. Wasn't even worth £1, because you needed that much work done. And we called a public meeting, and we explained to women that we'd like this centre to get up and running, and that we wanted to be a place for women where women could feel safe. And that was the sort of ethos behind it.
Times were hard. Most people were out of work, so there wasn't much money about, but we did fundraise. We would have had discos or fun runs or nothing in a grand scheme, but small weekly or monthly fundraising events. That's how we sort of kept the place turning over.
We were meant to do it up, but we didn't have the money to do it up, so it was holes in the ceiling, there was pigeon flying about. mice running about the floor that you tried to, you know, hope that nobody saw while they were coming in looking for advice.
There was no ground floor. You had to go up a flight of stairs, and there was a tiny room when you got to the top of the stairs, and you went up another small flight of stairs, and there was a large room. And so we decided that we would use the small room as an office, even though we didn't have anybody to work in an office. But we decided we'd use that for an office, so that would be the first place someone would call. And then the big room, we had an open fire, which was very nice. We got a new floor and all in eventually, and we bought toys because we wanted it to be a place where women could come in and with their children and feel at ease.
We then applied to the ACE funding at the time, which was Action for Community Employment. And we got positions for an advice worker, a part-time fundraiser, and a creche worker. Women started coming into it basically for tea and just to nosy, because I think at first it was a wee bit, the people were a bit apprehensive of a women's centre. They didn't know what it meant, you know, was it one of these trendy lefty things? But I think because there was local women involved in it, it took off easier.
It was very much about practical stuff when we started. Really, really practical stuff. Of how do we get this woman out of there? How do we get her children safe?
We didn't have any education or training or anything like that. It was simply somewhere where women felt safe, that they could talk about their problems. You know, like say if it was debt, you know, how can we help? We would have went with them, say, to the housing executive or the electricity office to arrange to pay on a weekly basis. If they had a mortgage, we would have suggested they went down or went with them to the Building Society and arranged to pay on a weekly basis as opposed to paying it every month, so that they were able to pay their bills.
It was the first attempt to create a space within a community that was about women, for women, by women, where there were no taboo subjects. The patriarchy that I was talking about didn't go away in 69 and 70 after internment because women became organised. It didn't disappear, it was still there. It was still a very conservative society. Contraception wasn't spoken about. Violence against women wasn't spoken about.
In terms of domestic violence, there wouldn't have been a big support from police. They wouldn't necessarily come into your areas, so you could have phoned for them and they wouldn't come. Part of their excuse was that they had their own safety. They didn't know if they were coming to an issue or if they were being set up for attack. So you didn't have any sort of assistance. We do have memories and stories of women phoning for their husband to be taken away and their husband being dropped at the corner and then being allowed to walk back. So there was no protection for women really in the 1980s.
There was issues from obviously not having any money, housing problems, there was issues of people being physically abused and sexually abused, domestic violence. There was also obviously issues of people being arrested.
Unemployment was very high and there was very little work, and mainly it was local work that you were looking, so you really didn't go far out of your community to look for work. In terms of the housing and the overcrowding in housing, we have Adir's flats and we have Moyard flats, and they were very overcrowded. You would have had maybe 10 children till a 3-bedroom flat, and that's 10 children plus a mother and father. 12 children, I know families that's had 12 in them. We were lucky because we had only 5 for the 3-bedroom, so 3 girls sharing a room wasn't too bad. But yes, you would have had overcrowding like that. You also had the issue of prescription drugs, which we look at today in the centre as a part of a throwback from the conflict. You did grow up where you had your house raids and you had your family and friends being lifted, family and friends being killed. So it was very natural for somebody in the street to have a tablet like a diazepam, or I think they called them roach tablets in them days. And it was like, get a wee roach, she needs to settle down, it'll calm her nerves. So tablets were passed freely with the best of intentions.
any issue that you could imagine that would affect women in working class areas, the Women's Centre dealt with it.
If people were going for, say, separations or whatever, we would have accompanied them to, say, a solicitor, go along to the courts with them. If they wanted to go to Women's Aid, we would have went along with them, showed them where, you know, introduced them and let them see what the place was like and did they want to stay or whatever. So we just supported them in every way we could.
By having a place that women could go to where they could talk confidentially about what was going on and not feel that they were letting their community down, it was a very necessary thing.
I think it was hard for women to come and say, yes, I'm the battered woman that you've been talking about. You know, I'm the woman that gets kicked and beaten at night.
I remember thinking, why do women accept all of this for men, you know? Why would you not wait till he's sleeping, hit him a digging or something, you know? And it was only after talking to these women that I realised that their self-esteem is so low, because if you've been told constantly that you're useless, that you're no good, you're a lousy mother, you're a fat bitch, you know, you can't cook, you can't do this, you can't do nothing, you know, that has an impact on you, obviously. I'll give you an example. I'm in the Women's Centre this day, and this wee man comes to the door and shouts up the stairs. And we had a sign saying no men allowed. And he said, can I speak to you? And I says, well, we don't let men in, you know. Only because we want it safe for women. But I says, I'll have a yarn with you anyway, what's your problem? He said, it's my daughter. Her husband's beaten her, whatever. And I said, well, look, you really can't do anything about that, neither can we. But you can tell your daughter to come down and we'll certainly speak to her and see if we can help her or support her in whatever decision she takes. But it needs to be her decision. She needs to come down. So several days later, the daughter came down. Lovely girl, really lovely young woman. I chatted to her anyway. Decided she was going to go to Women's Aid. So goes up to bring her to Women's Aid, and her mother was there. And her mother was a lovely woman too. Very skinny, but a nice wee woman. And she said to me, isn't it great to have somewhere to go? I wish I had had somewhere to go when I was a young woman. I said, did he beat you? She says, yes. I said, would you believe that? Now, he was going for his daughter, but he had beat her mother, you know?
Some of the women that I know were very publicly outspoken about women's issues, had very difficult times at home, but didn't want anyone to know. Yeah, it used to surprise me, the people that would come in to me as a solicitor who were having a really bad time and yet were wonderfully vocal on behalf of everyone else.
Everybody, it was all obviously volunteer work, and everybody had children, and there was a lot of other things going on in the world at that time as well. But it was quite a demanding time.
But I suppose I never stopped moving, really, for a long time, when I look back on it.
It was very exhausting, but it was a good time. It was, you could see sort of the seed growing, as the years moved on.
Different ones had their roles, and people accepted whatever role. For example, you had someone who was really good at fundraising. Never one of my better things. There was ones who were good at organising. So you just get to know who was good at what, and everyone accepted what their role was.
There was a lot of people who were fighting hard for different things, setting up alternatives, working out what was needed and doing it. It was great people to be connected with.
I moved to Belfast in 1988, towards the end of 1988, and the Troubles were still going on. Like the army would have been around and up and down the streets, and there would have been bomb scares daily, checkpoints. There was, I think one of my most vivid memories was the hairdresser that I would have gone to was shot, and I found that really, really hard to cope with because I'd never, ever seen anything like that in London, where I grew up. A lot of people would say, why did you stay here? But at the same time, I liked the people and I liked the lifestyle that it offered. Plus, I was in love. After the breakdown of my marriage, I was passing by one day and just called in, and they sorted me out with counselling and courses. I did lots of courses in the Women's Centre. They're like Women Moving On, Women Progressing, Steps to Excellence, those sort of self-esteem courses, which I really enjoyed, and they would have looked after the children as well in the creche.
I think it developed a lot of women's talents and showed women what they could do and allowed women the freedom to be in charge of things and do things, and also allowed them to say that things that happened to them that were wrong.
I think if you ask women who were in the local area what they thought, I mean, I think they would say that it was very important for them, because even if they didn't avail of it, the fact that it was there, they felt safe that it was there. They knew there was somewhere you could go.
I had no family or anything here either to turn to, so they were great. I used to be down like 3 or 4 times a week just to call in, just for somebody to have a wee chat to. Do you know, if you're feeling a bit low and isolated, and they sort of offered you help and support to build up your own self-esteem and make you realise there is life after marriage breakup, and you will get there. At the time it didn't feel like that, but looking back, I'm a completely different person now to what I was then.
Anything that gives you confidence is good. Anything that can make you feel that you're an important person, you know, and that there's nobody better than you, and that you have a right. You have a right to a decent life. You have a right to a roof over your head. You have a right to a decent job, and you have a right to live free from some man beating you. You know, any place that has that, I think, that's important.
The Falls Women's Centre helped establish a centre for women on the Loyalist side in the Shankill. There was always a wee sort of to and fro with us with the Shankill. Even at the height of the Troubles, we still managed to cross the divide, because women can cross the divide. They've other common issues that they can talk about. I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, there was an issue where the Falls Women's Centre lost their funding from Belfast City Council in regards to being accused of being a political organisation. When we lost the funding, the Shankill came out in full force and with full support. It wasn't a big long period of time, I know that it was a very short period of time, but funding was restored. We still have very good strong links with the Shankill Women's Centre. Women come here for training, we go over there, and we meet through the network once a month, because we sit on it now as committee and as directors. So we have our friendships that were formed then are still formed today, and we still have our common purpose.
It has developed into what we wanted it to be. It became a resource for women, a place that they could come with their children to take advice if they needed it, to develop their education, and that is what the Women's Centre has become. It has become a total success story.
In terms of reflecting back in the 1980s to when the centre was formed to where we are today, we own this 3-storey building. Our downstairs floor is childcare. We provide free childcare to women coming for training or coming for the advice department, and we also provide paying childcare at the very low cost for single parents and parents. So we have a whole wee business machine working downstairs for us. We have a wide range of training. We are an accredited centre and deliver our own training right through with our own computer suite. right up into a diploma level. We now deliver diploma in counselling, therapeutic counselling. And again, that came from actually looking at the need in the area. Because of the conflict and coming out of the conflict, there's a lot of trauma in West Belfast. And people are only learning to deal with actually what they lived through in the last 30 years. What seemed normal actually isn't normal. And we're only realising it now. And the effects and the impact it had on our lives is impacting how we go forward in our lives. So through that, we decided then to deliver counselling where women became accredited counsellors and they can go back out into the community to counsel. And now we deliver it ourselves. We actually own the programme. So we've moved in terms of that. We've our wee knitting group here that meet every Wednesday. They have their tea, they chat, and it's a great way of socialising. In terms of issues, there are issues that are still needing to be addressed, because we have found there's very much a gap for the women, the 40 plus women who came through the conflict. There's very much a displacement with them. They came through where they didn't work. They had long-term unemployment. They didn't get the skills that they would have normally got in a normal society. And now they're being faced with either trying to find employment or trying to gain new skills to move into employment, or that they've been so long unemployed, they're still unemployed. And we're finding that gap, and we're trying to address it in ways of the education, of a social aspect, of the personal development and the confidence building. You have to individually take each group, because we do have the young women too, who young teenage mothers, young women who's left school with little or no educational attainment. And we hope that by focusing on the centre and by focusing on education, they will eventually progress into employment. And we work within the community to try and just make life that wee bit easier for women, particularly for women, and to build women up. We would roughly have, I would say, about 3,000 women come through this centre a year. And that's a lot to cater for. So it's a very busy organisation. We've 20 staff. When you go back to years ago, I think you were lucky to have maybe 3 staff.
Some of the workers have been people who have come in for advice or for whatever, got involved in it, and then eventually became workers in the centre. It was almost like a full circle for them, which was a great thing.
After I did the courses here, I did most of my work was voluntary work, because my children were young and I wanted to see them through school and be there for them while they were at school. So the Falls Women's Centre was my first paid employment since I had, in about 14 years, since I had my first daughter. So I sort of started at the beginning, came the whole way through, and trained elsewhere, and then come back to offer my services.
The greatest change probably is that people now accept that there is domestic violence and that help does need to be given, and that women can do things and women can rear children, and women aren't just the partners of men. And that may all seem terribly obvious, but it wasn't at the start. At the start it was, if a woman wasn't married to somebody or the daughter of somebody or the wife of somebody, she wasn't really considered anything. Whereas over the years, women are women who can do things themselves.
Although Belfast is a much freer, livelier, less male patriarchal place than it was, I think it's still about there. People, still think of feminism as a dirty word instead of a label to wear with pride.
The Women's Centre is continuing today, albeit in a different way and in a different place. But very important that they are, and I also think it's very important that they are localised. because people just feel safe. And okay, it's a different place now, but not so different.
The fact that it's still there today, I mean, it's wonderful, you know, and it just shows you what women can do when they get organised.
If there's something that you feel strongly about, don't talk about it, just do it.